coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
The older I get, the more I see true. I mean, they were fine with controlled opposition. But the thing about Trump, right, is the same thing as the spirit of Wall Street bets or the spirit of any kind of movement or person that is just not going to surrender, terrified them. And it was clear that the same reason people like Trump, he was not afraid of them. That is what terrifies them about anyone and any movement, anything that they can't control. And so it's not just fury. And then, of course, their tools are melting away when it's clear that the power of the media isn't the same as it used to be. And of course, the net result of this year for most people is to reduce the credibility or the legitimacy of institutional authority or expert authority.
Welcome, everyone, once again to, what are we doing here? The Roundtable, the editors and publishers podcast here at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the publisher. That works, Jake. Of the Claremont Review Books and the American Mind. I am joined by Matthew Peterson, vice president of education here at Claremont and founding editor of the American Mind, Spencer Clavin, associate editor of both the Claremont Review Books and the American Mind, and Seth Barron, all the way from New York. Well, we're all scattered these days, but and Seth is managing editor of the American Mind, frequent denizen on Tucker Carlson. Go buy Seth's book, forthcoming in May, maybe already out, on New York. I think it's coming in May, on New York and the future of New York City. Well, lots to talk about today here on Wednesday, March 31st. We thought we'd open with this business in Georgia. So the Georgia state legislature passed some electoral reforms around voting. Aspersions have been cast since our savvy listeners here will remember this, of course, since the governorship was lost narrowly to Kemp by Stacey Abrams. Of course, it's one of these claims of election fraud from the left that goes completely forgotten in memory hold. But there are many on the left that maintain to this day that Stacey Abrams should be governor of Georgia and that there were problems at the ballot box and there were problems with the Secretary of State before the election, who happened to be Kemp himself, purging voter rolls of ineligible voters and folks who shouldn't be there. Anyway, this is kind of the old backdrop of this reform. The Republicans in Georgia decided they needed to tighten up some of their practices, especially after all the grief they'd gotten in light of 2020, mostly from the pro-Trump folks. But if you read the bill or read dispassionate summaries of it, it's, pretty straightforward. It kind of restricts a little bit the length of time you can request mail-in balloting, but it does not restrict it overly much. It tightens up some processes on Election Day, especially this one's been getting a lot of heat. It bans basically independent groups from providing water to people in line. Now, this has been characterized as just callous voter suppression and, wanting to, starve out and starve through thirst, especially minorities from their long lines and prevent them from having a pleasant voting experience. But actual election officials can still, of course, provide refreshments there, including water and everything else. So you can go grab your water and then stand in line. Anyway, our listeners are probably well acquainted with some of this controversy, and if they aren't, they can go read about it. I just wanted to read the kind of top-line summary from Politico from Saturday, because I think it gives you the lay of the land, and then we can opine on it. Saturday's a little stale, but this narrative has held and even been amplified. So Biden urges Congress to pass election reform in wake of Georgia voting restrictions. That's from Ben Leonard. I don't have the links. I don't know what publication, but go check it out. It has nothing to do with fairness, nothing to do with decency. This is Biden. They passed the law saying you can't provide water for people standing in line while they're waiting to vote. You don't need anything else to know that this is nothing but punitive, designed to keep people from voting. You can't provide water, people about to vote? Give me a break. Picture Biden's voice there. Trump, of course, is in favor of it, as he does insert himself into this news cycle. And Trump's quote was, "Too bad these changes could not have been done sooner." He means not depriving people of water in line, but rather tightening up voting requirements. New York Times' Nick Corsiniti and Reed Epstein write that the fight over voting rights is emerging as one of the defining conflicts of the Biden era. It's a little early, I think, to make such a claim, but okay. And offer a preview of how it will play out in the coming months. This is quoting them again. Civil rights groups immediately challenged the Georgia law in federal court, backed by prominent Democratic voting rights lawyers. Several black leaders described the legal skirmishes to come as an existential fight for representation, saying the law clearly puts a target on black and brown voters. Protests against voting restrictions unfolded this week in state capitals like Austin, Texas, and Atlanta, and more lawsuits are expected. Of course, business is getting in on this, and popular sports as well. The sort of normal cycle of the rolling left wing or sort of center left, which by the standards of 20 years ago is also left wing today, sort of media op rolls through as institutions of commanding heights in our popular culture, including sports and media, sort of get in on this game one after another. The 91st MLB All-Star Game is scheduled to be played in Atlanta this July, but on Thursday, in the wake of voting restriction legislation, and notice that framing, signed into law by the Georgia governor, the executive director of the MLB Players Association said the players are ready to discuss moving their annual midsummer exhibition out of Georgia. And then the National Black Justice Coalition has urged the PGA to pull the Masters tournament at Augusta National Golf Club next month. He also encouraged golfers to not play the event. This will really have no traction given just the nature of the PGA and its audience, and they're not wanting to make terrible business decisions. But it's pretty extraordinary. I mean, for those not acquainted with professional golf, the Masters, of course, is always only played at Augusta National Golf Club, a storied venue there. This is an interesting development. And then finally, I think most interesting, and this shows the dexterity with which the coalition on the left adapts and never lets a controversy go to waste. And also, that's the main takeaway from this. They've rolled this into questions of D.C. statehood. So Carl Hulse at the New York Times reports that Democratic activists want the party to go all in by including D.C. statehood in whatever voting rights bill they try to pass. Some backers of statehood say that they see the more comprehensive legislation as the most expedient route, and that the current Democratic effort to protect minority voting rights would fall short if residents of the nation's capital ultimately lacked representation. They don't state it in this poll quote, but of course, behind that is the extent to which the district has a large, to use the terms of the left, forgive me, black and brown population. I think that's wrapped into this quote. The call to include statehood in broad democratic legislation that would institute fundamental changes in the nation's conduct of elections and campaigns is a strategic shift for the activists. They had coalesced behind an independent measure that would make the District of Columbia the 51st state and entitle residents who pay federal taxes to voting representation in the House and Senate. The change in tactics is not endorsed by Senate backers of the legislation, who still see a separate statehood bill as the best approach for both statehood and the voting rights measure. So interesting. One thing to watch will be the extent to which the Senate backers of the legislation, which we've argued on this podcast and in print, sort of normal normal Democratic lawmaker types are beholden to their left wing and usually fall in line. So this will be one to watch as well. But this is, and then finally, it's not in this recap, but Joe Biden, I think it was at the press conference, he had some canned line that was written for him, which I'll drop a forbidden name. John Derbyshire has mocked on his podcast, which is funny. Biden's line about this is that the legislation in Georgia would make Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle, which rhetorically is an interesting way of putting it. I think what he meant really is that Jim Crow would look so this legislation would make Jim Crow look like Jim Sparrow rather than look like something more formidable. But anyway, where to begin? I'll shut the hell up and let people talk. But this is the emerging narrative, right? Any attempt to make sure that voting is somehow tied to even the minimal requirements of proving who you are in some rigorous fashion, to trying to rein in the extent to which COVID, on top of everything else, leads for the left to push for ever loosening voting parameters and pitching it always as just the expansion of democracy and trying to sweep under the rug any of the demonstrable ways in which loosening these sorts of things leads to higher error rates and the possibility of more dead people. There are obviously dead people aren't voting, but more dead names voting, more mail-in ballot irregularities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is all, the rhetorical strategy is as effective, unfortunately, so far as it is predictable from the left, which is to say the Republicans are the party of Jim Crow and restrictions of voting, and any objection raised to the way we conduct elections across our 50 diverse states, no matter how error-prone or problematic or inefficient or sort of capricious at times or anything else, is just pitched as the squelching of democracy.
I'm kind of interested in this narrative framing. It seems to me of a piece with what's going on right now with like stories about the fight over transgender people in sports and stuff, where, in that dimension, every attempt to keep girl sports for girl sports, basic common sense stuff, right? Like, don't give kids puberty blockers that will have negative consequences on their reproductive health for life. Like, any attempt to just reinstall a little bit of sanity on this is described by CNN or the ACLU as an attack on the health of trans youth, right? So every headline comes with 5 different assumptions pre-packaged into it that frame the story already the way that the left wants it framed. And here, right, I mean, voting rights, election integrity, voter ID laws, right? This is an issue which is 0% about race. It's not even a little bit about race. It's not even race is a factor in the way that these laws are written. It has purely to do with the fact that we're a country where if our elections aren't sort of verifiably fair, and if people don't verify their identity before they vote, you're going to have major unrest, because that's the only thing keeping us from anarchy, is our trust that elections represent the will of the people. So then this whole thing gets trotted out, right, in every legacy media outlet. I hesitate to call them orifices, although that's practically what they are at this point. In every legacy media outlet, this gets trotted out as some grand battle over whether white supremacy is going to take over the country or not, or continue, to run the country would be the narrative, right? And yet at the same time, and this is a question that I have for you guys, right? There must be a dwindling number of people whose minds are actually changed by that narrative. I recognize that it's been hugely successful in creating a significant number of people in this country who believe crazy, raging falsehoods about the nation, about what's going on in it, about what the challenges are. But everybody else who has not already drunk that Kool-Aid is reading these stories, right, and calling BS with extreme prejudice. So I guess I wonder, what is this accomplishing anymore? Are there how many people are there left in America who have not yet made up their minds about whether they buy this stuff or not? And is that a hopeful? I mean, that seems like a kind of hopeful sign, in the sense of the people who believe in this garbage are already sunk. But does anybody else?
It does seem like we have 2 Overton windows that don't overlap. I mean, I don't know if that metaphor holds up, but it seems like the 2 sides view things in view the same facts completely differently. And I mean, this is what they keep talking about, the disunity and the lack of common ground, to the point where the media comes out and says that, oh, they're trying to, disenfranchise all of the blacks of Georgia, and half the country rolls its eyes and half the country nods its head. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure where we go from there. But regarding the elections, one thing that I find very interesting, in terms of the water that's being denied, in New York at least, and I think in most places, the actual balloting, like your poll site, is staffed by local, basically people who are hired or appointed by the local electeds, like whoever the officials in the Democratic Party are, or the Republican Party, or whoever. But my point is that when you see long lines on election day, where, like, say, black people, I mean, this seems to be a staple of election day now, is they show a white polling place, and people just walk in and vote, and they show long lines of black people waiting online. And the implication is that this is all being directed by white supremacists in the State House. But in fact, I believe it reflects very much local dysfunction, in the same way that, in Flint, Michigan, or wherever, the water, they screwed up their management of the water. Well, they also screw up their management of elections. So this is really like a local issue. Mm-hmm. Tell me if I'm wrong.
I think that's right, Seth. I think it's a microcosm of the larger system, which has always been very decentralized. So you have kind of wild, well, not necessarily wild, but you have a patchwork of personnel manning these sorts of things, and it relies on a lot of volunteers from the local party, right? That's also the case. So, and I don't know if I quite got the thought out. I think I wanted to not belabor it too much, but yeah, the purpose of the banning of the handing out water is to prevent some electioneering that inevitably goes on with, it's kind of the modern equivalent of, getting the machine vote out by paying all the neighborhood drunks to vote a certain way and booze. It's like a more benign and sort of cleverer version of that with less enticement. I mean, they're just hydrating you, and they can maybe do some electioneering while you're waiting in line. But no, that's right. And the Georgia law provides, I think, a mechanism for a more, I don't think the state majority, but maybe that's the case, to take over these precincts if they get on election day, not to take them over totally, but to sort of take control of them if they get too dysfunctional. Yeah, all those things are true.
The local thing, Seth, is, I think, really important because this whole event is of a piece with the kind of war on localism. This idea that, like, you can't actually, with these issues that require, local competency and admit of sort of several methods that could differ between states, right? Like, there is no longer, the leading faction of the left no longer wants to allow that to happen. We talked last week about Kristi Noem, feeling like she had to basically veto or at least send back this bill on transgender sports. And the reason that she cited was because the NCAA, right, this national college tournament organization, was going to boycott or even sue. There's this sense that if you take matters in your community into your own hands, then you in your little burg or city or state are going to be faced with this enormous national hammer of woke conglomerate corporations. I mean, this is not the first time that Georgia has been up against this very thing. When there was a bill on the table to ban abortion after a fetal heartbeat was detected, Disney's chief executive Bob Iger said that it's going to be very hard for Disney to film, to bring its business into Georgia if they pass this law, mm-hmm. right? Disney, a company that films in Xinjiang, that plasters its remake of Mulan all over Netflix, in the background of which are essentially concentration camps, this is happening now again with they said, well, we're not going to film in Georgia because of this. voting rights law. And Mark Hamill, right, like, you know, the star of Star Wars, this is Luke Skywalker, was like, yeah, no filming in Georgia. Whereupon I have to give a shout out to Josh Herr, my boyfriend, and the executive, the in-house counsel to Daily Wire. He goes, you filmed in Tunisia, where they will literally pull you off the street for looking gay and like forcibly sodomize you before they throw you in prison. Like, you know, this is like, you know, hypocrisy of the first water, but it's also an extremely, you know, coercive tactic. It's like, you know, you can't make a law of your own. It's sort of the anti-localism, the anti, like, you know, states' rights. Is like, you can't make a single law of your own without these massively powerful sort of para-government institutions, these corporations, like, you know, threatening to bring down the hammer.
Yeah, it'd be good to see some real pushback from the states on this tactic. I think they have quite a few levers in their toolkit. I don't know if I mentioned it on here before, but Matt Brainerd, who did the bunch on election integrity stuff, including setting up a call center by just calling voters if they voted the way that it was reported. He suggests he started up a new little think tank, and they're going to do some activism and local voting stuff, which is his previous area, his original area of expertise. And he proposed, you know, these states should pass a law. His original one was, I think it had to do with critical race theory, but I don't see why it couldn't be applied to this. But any company that ends up calling for a boycott of a state government and doing business in a state as retaliation for what otherwise would have been considered in previous eras normal legislation and normal deliberation about police powers and exercising police powers, that is, the powers over health, safety, and morals that states always exercise, that company just wouldn't get any state contracts anymore in any sort of fashion. And you could extend that net, I think, to affiliates and do a kind of secondary boycott initiated by the state and contracting. Anyway, just a thought. Someone out there who's more involved can run with that one and see if it has any legs. And we shouldn't forget, of course, North Carolina and the bathroom bill, transgenderism. And then before that, the OG example, which Mike Pence caved to when he was governor of Indiana, was the basically state-based RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act. They wanted to pass something like it at the state level, and they ultimately backed down after pressure from business. It's become a pretty effective tactic for the left, and so they deploy it increasingly on issues that seem to have a tenuous connection to any abuse of actual rights. But you know,
before that, I believe, wasn't it Arizona that didn't have an official Martin Luther King Jr. Day, even though I don't think it really mattered very much, and they faced all kinds of boycotts. Can't remember if that goes back to the 80s or the 90s.
Yeah,
but
that's right. And then that reared its head again with Arizona's empowering of its local law enforcement officers to inquire of the immigration status of folks. And, you know, I think California banned, what did they do? I think they banned any of their government employees or agencies from doing any conference business in Arizona or something like that. Yeah, this has a long pedigree. Well, long in current time. I mean, a few decades back. Well, let's move on to Facebook. So everyone knows that Trump, especially, partly after the election and then spreading quickly to more platforms after January 6th, has been banned from all social media, more or less. There's this newest example from Facebook. Lara Trump wanted to do an interview of her father and did, and was going to upload it to Facebook. And Facebook, which had previously banned, of course, Trump was banned and campaign stuff with Trump was banned, sort of updated their policy, it seems, at about 4 minutes prior to posting, and said that content posted in the voice of President Trump is not currently allowed on our platforms, including new posts with President Trump speaking, and will be removed. This guidance applies to all campaign accounts and pages, including Team Trump, other campaign messaging vehicles on our platforms, and former surrogates. So this is perfectly predictable. Of course, it's been clear to us, and we've talked about it a bit, that the goal with all of this is to basically exile Trump from public life or from effective communication across national platforms and public life. Trump's made an end run around this a bit by just having it's kind of office issue emails to their groups, and then it spreads on social media. And people who've been paying attention have noticed occasionally these sort of email press releases look increasingly like tweets, 2 sentences asking about the Durham report or the status of Durham, and it not really being much of any kind of statement. So that's interesting and amusing in its own way. But proponents of the president and his agenda, which in many respects those of us on this podcast consider ourselves to be our former agenda, should be heartened by this. I mean, it shows that he's still very much a threat in national political life. Otherwise, why take such drastic measures and sort of comprehensive measures to keep him and his voice even off any national social media platform? And it also touches on a lot of our themes from this as well. And I'll direct everyone to our recent editor's note, actually from today. Seth got it up today. Go to AmericanMind.org and see our editor's statement on our recent run-in with YouTube. Hey, everybody. Sorry for the break. Ryan Williams here, host and president of the Claremont Institute. We had to just cut a bit from this podcast, at least to the extent that we posted on, or at least for the YouTube version. We exercised some editorial discretion to keep us from certain soft persecution by certain social media platforms, given the subject matter much in the news these days and kind of controversial. Anyway, if you want to listen to this section of that can't be had on this platform, please follow the link in the notes at the bottom of, or not the bottom, but right at the bottom of the recording here on YouTube. And as always, thanks for listening. But this should be encouraging, this effort, because it seems to me a drastic response and sort of clownish to anyone who looks at it on its face, a clownish attempt to sort of to exile the former president from any access to real national digital means of communication. That means they really think he's still a threat.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, this kind of internal exile, I can't think of exactly a parallel, but it's so like czarist in a weird way. Or, I mean, it almost seems like they legitimately are expecting him like a return from Elba type of situation. Like he's going to, like if he were to issue a call and march on Washington. I mean, they really legitimately seem afraid that he's going to do something like that.
Yeah.
And you're right. I mean, on one level, it's kind of depressing that we're now living in under a weird sort of authoritarianism. Like, I mean, you look back, it's like the Palmer raids, this type of situation where you can't say certain things, where you can be interdicted. But at the same time, you're right. It's like, if they're this afraid, I mean, he must be immensely powerful. I mean, they must know something. It doesn't make any sense otherwise.
Yeah, it's a bit like our discussion of whether or not the sort of crazy overreaction, which we're still in the midst of. Anyone who's been to downtown DC or around Capitol Hill sees the razor wire and National Guard still all there. I mean, it's just really surreal to see an MRAP, outside of the Capitol, right behind some barbed wire fence. Is this a sign of strength or weakness of the current regime, or I don't want to get too sort of a banana republic or Turkey about this. We don't need to call it a regime, but just the current administration and its overreaction to January 6th that seems to have no end in sight. Is this a sign of strength or a sign of weakness? It seems to me this is increasingly a sign of, if not weakness, at least sort of panic in the face of a threat that's pretty exaggerated. I mean, those of us who live in normal America see the former president for what he is, which is he continues to be a powerful force in American political life. He still has a lot of many millions of devoted followers. And, he wants to use that politically for a variety of reasons. But I don't think any of us think it's to somehow, the deepest levels of QAnon notwithstanding, to somehow retake the government. I think it's probably to get involved in electoral politics, to press his claim, what he thinks are legitimate claims of being badly treated in various ways, and to continue to exercise political power outside the normal channels of it. That is to say, sort of normal power over public opinion and powers through super PACs and normal electoral politics, which is most of what he called for actually on January 6th, as our colleague Charles Kessler pointed out in the Claremont Review books.
Yeah, it's kind of this weird thing that, on the one hand, the sort of damnatio memoriae of Trump's social media presence that occurred, right? Like, never shall this name be spoken again across any of the major platforms. One of the remarkable things to me that kind of really convinced me that these corporations are serious threats to American civic integrity was that it worked in a certain way. Like, there was a way in which they neutered him for a large majority of the population who was not devoted enough to him to be like showing up at his rallies every time, or like even maybe signing up for his email lists, but followed him on Twitter and kind of either enjoyed his tweets or found them remarkable or weird or crazy. Like, the oversized effect that he was having on our national imagination was like radically altered. So on that level, I wonder if their appetite is whetted, like whether Seth, as you say, like their ability to sort of weirdly exile somebody might have encouraged them to make it further unacceptable. I mean, they're pushing him further and further outside the Overton window, right? Like, anything associated with him, anybody who supports him, anybody who suggests that he was right about some things, like they want all of that to be taboo. But then on the other hand, right, like it sort of didn't work in the sense that it made of him this like powerful presence in absence, this just like, a specter that now just gets to like magnify ghoulishly over us in the image of the left's worst nightmares. Like, who is he? Where is he? What is he doing? The Trump, the international man of mystery. Like, every now and then a picture of him pops up and he actually looks really good. Like, he seems to have lost some weight. Like, there's this like this hushed anticipation of what he'll do next that is fomented in part by the attack on him. Like, meanwhile, it seems like, I don't know if you guys saw Jack Dorsey's latest appearance before Congress, but he was making these weird, noises, although nobody knows how sincere, about like, actually, we did have a censorship problem. Actually, it was bad that we banned New York Post, and maybe there's some sort of like open source solution to this or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. The regime has an obvious aim. It also seems to me pretty clear that not just the regime, but the establishment is like profoundly inept at thinking about or acting on, on digital technology, on managing the situation, which is rapidly spiraling out of their control. Although they're willing to do a lot of damage in the process of just exerting their ineptitude. And then on top of that, like way smarter people than Joe Biden are running these companies and having like actual more, like they are the ones having the actual moral debate internally right now about how this country should be ruled and governed. And like, they shouldn't have that power, but they're the like serious adults having that discussion, it seems to me.
Yeah, and we should say, as many people, I think we said before on this podcast, and many people who are closer to the center of the tech world than we are, will say, I mean, it's just true that Jack Dorsey has pressures on him, powerful forces to deal with that are just far more powerful than anyone on the right is even connected to. So, even if the right wanted to, unless if it doesn't have government to utilize, it doesn't have the powerful institutions, never mind the power of China to kind of threaten, or the sort of power that they have to navigate. And it's clear that I think I do want to say, it seems to me this is somewhat unprecedented in American history that someone would be cut out like this, of that prominence, in such a clear and universal kind of way, where they're just cutting Trump's voice. They're trying to choke it out, and then demonize half the country. This is still happening. I almost think it's such a unique event, a revolting event, that it's almost too much for people to handle. Right? You have to kind of remind yourself that the president of the United States is not able to use the serious any of the major media channels out there, and that half the country is being regarded as terrorists. I mean, so I'm of two minds about it as well. I mean, on the one hand, it is unprecedented. It's, you know, if you didn't realize what was going on the first time you heard about it, it should be terrifying. When you kind of realize what's happening, and the powers that be are, you know, doubling, trebling, quadrupling down, and at full force turned up to 11 to try to make the tech companies and everyone else censor and punish half the country. But yeah, the sunny side of this equation, if there is one, is that you can sense the panic, right? You can sense the fury is not just anger. The fury is also, seems to me, born of a kind of panic where they realize, you know, that half the country really did reject them. And this goes back to Anton's essay, and something that just the older I get, the more I see true. I mean, they were fine with controlled opposition. But the thing about Trump, right, is the same thing as the spirit of Wall Street bets or the spirit of any kind of movement or person that is just not going to surrender, terrified them. And it was clear that the same reason people like Trump, he was not afraid of them. That is what terrifies them about anyone and any movement, anything that they can't control. And so it's not just fury. And then, of course, their tools are melting away when it's clear that the power of the media isn't the same as it used to be. And of course, the net result of this year for most people is to reduce the credibility or the legitimacy of institutional authority or expert authority. And so, you know, I mean, the people aren't stupid. They can sense that most people don't think the law or the experts or the institutions, they don't trust them, and they don't think that they're what they used to be. And the more that they sense that, the more they double down with authoritarian measures. And, you know, I mean, so there's a white bill here, there's a black bill here. But I think what everyone needs to realize, if you're sitting there complacent, is it doesn't matter if most people realize that this is wrong, and most people realize that, you know, this shouldn't be happening, because most people in any totalitarian regime in the beginning realized the same. They were just too afraid to speak up, and they weren't actually in power, and the country rolled. That happened in the Soviet Union, happened in many other countries. It could easily happen here. Some would say it already has. But you know, that is the dynamic. And I think a lot of people I hear, you know, are torn between the two scenarios, the upside and the downside. And here we are.
You know, I just thought of a parallel in American history, which might be Eugene Debs, who was put in prison for sedition in 1918, near the end of the war, for urging resistance to the draft, and he was sentenced to like 20 years. Eventually, he was his sentence was commuted, but he ran for president from prison for the fourth time and did pretty well. I mean, it's almost like that. It's almost like, here's someone who is so intolerable, he has to be removed from the national scene. And, you know, tried for sedition, which is what they would like to, you know, they openly say they would like to try Trump for sedition.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. No, that was the exact word they used. I mean, I would just say briefly, I mean, continue the point, but I mean, even Debs, he did not have the support Trump did, right?
No.
The percentage, but it did. No, it's a very good analogy because it's instructive about the present moment.
Yeah, Debs, of course, not a former president. No, I mean,
no. But I'm just trying to think of, like, it's so weird to see the entire operation of the government just sidelining and totally, you know, making an outcast of a former president. It's crazy. It's like, I don't know what happened to Cromwell. I mean, I guess Cromwell died. I mean, it's hard to think about, like, when there's a regime change, what happens to the deposed party? And I guess a lot of time they flee to another country. I mean, I had kind of imagined that maybe Trump would have to go to Israel. I mean, at some point. I mean, wouldn't that be like? I mean, obviously he's not being like hounded to that degree.
Yeah.
But there's something.
Build a giant sweet mansion in the Golan Heights. That would be amazing.
Yeah. In Gone Trump.
There's something kind of telling about this, though, Seth, isn't there? I mean, you're absolutely right. The like ancient analog would be ostracism, but the whole point of ostracism is then you're gone. Like they want you out of the community, and like we actually, I think we can give ourselves credit for predicting this in a certain sense on this podcast, in that they don't want Trump gone at all. They know very, very plainly that he is like the linchpin of their entire story about America, the thing that they have made him out to be. Like if he were really excised from the public and the thorn in their side were forever removed, like what would they have to complain about? What would they have to stoke fear about? Like there's a real need for Trump in some capacity, like sitting around. Like they want him there as the bogeyman, even though they don't want him in any kind of power. And as an example,
so kind of like Goldstein in 1984.
Exactly.
Like this presence, they don't know, is he here? Is he not here? Is he infecting people with his rhetoric? I mean, something like that. Yeah, you're right. Like a specter.
Yeah, mm-hmm. And Goldstein's right. Nobody knows if he's confected or not, or if he exists. Right?
Right.
It's just this. Yeah, it's the same thing.
Yeah, it's there's an analog too in our history, right? It's very different in a way, but the waving of the bloody shirt that the Republicans would do decades after the Civil War. So it's not alien to our politics, the sort of perpetual use of now long gone symbols of something that's bad. But and it's not unknown to Democratic politics more generally. It makes perfect sense, but it certainly seems to be something new, especially as Seth, you say, and the Debs example is a nice contrast, especially for a former president. It's just, and I recall one item. I haven't seen much about it lately, but sort of, I forget, it was maybe 2-3 months ago. There's an effort to forbid Trump from having a presidential library anywhere in the country. I mean,
yeah.
And I think that will have, that will be a vehement effort on the side of sort of local. It will be mostly in the hands of local and state Democrats, wherever that might be. Would have been New York. That'll never happen, it seems to me. So it's going to have to be in Florida. But yeah, that'll be interesting to watch too. This man should not be able to erect some sort of monument to his legitimacy. And the presidential library is sort of the classic thing you do, right? After you're gone, it's the repository of your record and what you were about.
I think they have to get rid of him. Yeah, I mean, I don't like they're not gonna. I don't think they're gonna stop attacking him. I don't think they've quite reconciled themselves with what to do, and there's probably disagreement. But the problem is that the problem that they have is the more that they treat him like this, just completely cut him off in this disgraceful way and treat him as the big, Goldstein, the big bad guy in the background. The more they do that, the more actually they keep him relevant. And if they don't delegitimize him in some serious way, like some official way, I think what they're setting up, as a friend of mine pointed out a while ago to me before January 6th and everything else, he said, I see the theological narrative, the Christian, the hero is conquered and dies and comes back. That's the kind of heroic narrative. And they set that up because of what they knew they were going to do to him. And look, the more that they do this, if they don't officially delegitimize him by putting him in jail or prosecuting him in some way or lawsuits forcing him to leave, what they're setting up is a kind of revenge vote, the likes of which this country has never seen. Because regardless of what the media shows you, most Americans are watching and they have seen what's going on. And can you imagine, whether a lot of people who support Trump don't necessarily want him to run again, but you imagine the satisfaction that would come from shoving Trump down the throat of everyone, right, in 2024. I mean, they're making that more desirable every day, just out of sheer symbol. So, there's a lot that of course, it's an eternity until the next election. A lot could happen either way. He could damage his own brand in various ways. But the more they do this, the more they are setting a situation up that is even more unstable and more dangerous, and gives Trump and others who might represent him even more potential power to come storming back. But in a very strong kind of way. And so, this always happens, right? The more you double down, the more you try to control in this manner, the more you build up an energy that wants to oppose you, that's going to come back with equal force. And that's what they are doing. They are purposely doing that. They relish the thought of people trying to do the same thing the left does, so they can call them fascists, right? If you do the same thing the left does, you are a white supremacist, fascist, and a terrible human being. They can do whatever they want with impunity. And that they're welcoming that, and they're inviting it, and they're inviting a clash that's, gonna be, they're gonna up the ante, and that's what they want, and they're gonna get it.
It does seem like they by occulting him, by having him not being able to tweet all the time, by not seeing his face or hearing him. I mean, he really. It does seem like it's kind of amplifying his majesty for the people who love him. I mean, the mystique grows, and the few glimpses of him we get, like as Spencer said, he does look like he's lost weight, like he's doing like he's in the Florida sun. There's I mean, look, it could go either way, but it doesn't seem like it's hurting his image, because I think we all got a little overexposed to Trump, with his like incessant tweeting and like his off the wall comments sometimes. But being deprived of that, like some friends of mine the other day were saying that like they kind of wanted their Trump fix, like they miss him. And I think a lot of people, clearly MSNBC misses him.
Oh yeah. Yep.
So, I mean, does anybody doubt that if he wanted to, at this right now, if the Republican primaries were being held today and he wanted to get the nomination, I mean, there's no question he would have it.
No
contest. Anybody,
yeah,
it would just be like a repeat of 2016, but even, so this obviously terrifies the regime.
Yeah, it would be closer to 2020. It would just be a coronation, really.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I do like everyone loves the narrative arc, the comeback, right? So Trump's Spencer, especially, Trump, he starts lifting every day. He gets,
I was just going to say, it's white Trump summer. We're all getting ready for those of us who are not super online. The new trend is white boy summer, which has been parlayed into like everybody's trying to get in shape for the beach. And now I feel that as we're talking, I'm realizing that Trump is just participating in this. He's building up his mystique for the big reveal when the summer sun hits.
Yeah, down but not out for sure. That is Trump. I mean, I should mention that I've been saying his daughter, but of course Lara Trump is his daughter-in-law. But he did tease a 2024 run in that interview. Maybe that's one of the main reasons. Well, I mean, Facebook couldn't have known that. They just saw Lara Trump promoting it with screenshots ahead of time, so they really just wanted to keep him in exile. We're running out of time here, but I wanted to flag two things for us to discuss. We can do this first one quickly, and that is Afghanistan, the forever war to end all forever wars. A couple of flags to note, and then just we can talk quickly about it. I just think there are a few sort of delicious aspects to this New York Times piece from three co-authors, the title of which is Officials Try to Sway Biden Using Intelligence on Potential for Taliban Takeover of Afghanistan. I'll just read the opening paragraphs and then and then one in the middle, to couple in the middle, and then we can talk about it. As President Biden signaled this week that he would let a May 1st deadline pass without withdrawing American troops from Afghanistan, some officials are using an intelligence assessment to argue for prolonging the military mission there. American intelligence agencies have told the Biden administration that if U.S. troops leave before a power-sharing settlement is reached between the Taliban and the Afghan government, the country could fall largely under the control of the Taliban within 2 or 3 years after the withdrawal of international forces. That could potentially open the door for al-Qaeda to rebuild its strength within the country, according to American officials. The classified assessment, first prepared last year for the Trump administration, but not previously disclosed, is the latest in a series of grim predictions of Afghanistan's future that intelligence analysts have delivered throughout the 2-decade-long war. Last paragraph from this first section. But the intelligence has landed in a changed political environment. While President Donald J. Trump pushed for a withdrawal of all forces, even before the terms of the peace deal required it, Mr. Biden has been more cautious, saying Thursday that he does not view May 1st as a deadline he must meet, although he also said he, quote, could not picture, end quote, troops being in the country next year. So this is being portrayed as, Biden as sort of in the Obama administration, and even before, he cultivated this kind of centrist position as a skeptic of intervention in the Middle East. He famously thought that the Iraq war was a debacle, and even really at the outset of it said the only solution, which actually not that crazy and quite sensible in many ways, would be to partition the place into 3 different ethnic, ethno-nationalist religious communities, rather than keep the weird geographic space of Iraq together, which was kind of a confection of the end of World War I anyway. That was all sensible. But Biden, who's trying to portray himself here, and his people are trying to portray him as, look, the May 1st deadline, not hard, but we're getting out. We're still going to get out. We're not going to continue this. But I think the game was given away in these 2 paragraphs on the second page of this as printed out. For many Biden administration officials, the issue that has resonated the most clearly is the threat that a Taliban takeover could pose to Afghan women. While some former intelligence officials predict the Taliban will initially take care not to roll back women's rights altogether, at least in major cities, if they take over the entire country, it will be difficult to guarantee protections for women, such as education for girls and access to health care. Quote, any agreement must preserve their gains if Afghanistan wants to ensure the international community's continued political and financial support. Linda Thomas Greenfield, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, told the Security Council this week, we will not give an inch on this point. So Biden will sing to that tune, I believe, and his administration will as well. So this is just, while at outward appearances, it looks like the intelligence community, deep state, trying once again to do what it always does, which is to nudge an administration in a certain direction in consonance with its own interests, both financial and kind of mission creep institutional. That is to say, sort of U.S. as global hegemon, policeman, endless, forever war, soldier / sheriff / whatever. I think they'll end up getting their way, but not for those reasons, but rather for the sort of not that new, but the newest evolution of what has been a trend in American foreign policy since the rise of Woodrow Wilson and the progressive movement more generally, which is that we are, in fact, the policemen of the world. We are making the world safe for democracy. And that means these days, democracy, our democracy, as we've heard it over the last 6 to 8 months here in America, means our democracy with the whole suite of ever-changing rights that go along with it. And look, I don't mean to denigrate the decency and goodness of women having access to education, even in Afghanistan, or access to healthcare. But wrapped up in that statement about the concern for women's rights are all the other rights we're experiencing now here in America, which leads to, the transgender awareness days out of Kabul from the U.S. State Department. And so we're in this sort of untenable position, it seems to me, given traditional roles and prudent measures in international diplomacy, which is to say, do not overly aggravate countries abroad, especially ones that are kind of backwaters like Afghanistan is, unless you want to just stay there indefinitely. I mean, are we on the cusp of having transgender rights in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan? I really doubt it. Are we willing to pay the price to be sort of permanent viceroy imperialists around the world to enforce these sorts of things. The American people don't have patience for it, but the sort of the confluence of the international community or the intelligence community and also the latest woke Democrat priorities seems to me to suggest that there's no way we're leaving Afghanistan, and I'll be surprised if we do.
Doesn't this? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I agree totally with you, Ryan. And I think just last week, the State Department announced that, or the Homeland Security, anyways, it was announced that transgender and gay rights abroad are a matter of our own national security. So clearly, they're setting up, the next invasion to protect, the queer rights of who knows, the Turkmenis, the people in Belarus,
right?
Wherever we're headed, they're clearly not planning to scale down our foreign missions.
Doesn't it kind of feel to you guys like this is turning now into like third world countries as this avatar of what the left wants us to think about America? Like they have this story about America as this hideously oppressive, like anti-minority regime that just, commits these terrible atrocities. Cops just go out and look for black people to shoot. The schools and the parents are crushing transgender youth. Like, and now then there's this valorous sort of like, journey from that into a sort of genderless, borderless future. And it's I hear in Biden, like as Biden is talking about this, Biden's administration is thinking about like, well, if we can't, we have to be in Afghanistan as long as there's a threat to women's rights. It's like it's almost as if like, little like morality tale, like using. It's sick, but like using foreign policy and soldiers' lives as this morality tale to show, yes, like things really are, because in these countries, of course, like in many cases, things really are that bad. Like what the Taliban want for women is like as bad as what the left says America wants for women. And so it's like you hold that up and you show what a glorious, valiant regime this is to be fighting for transgender rights in Iran or whatever. And that is the like this kind of like weird, like dark mirror justification for doing all sorts of like crazy nonsense domestically. Like this seems to me to be all like, just narrative construction.
Yeah. It also shows the convergence of, it shows that the uniparty at work, right? I will call. And this has been argued by Angelo Codevilla and others, and even Charles Kessler in a way, in the Claremont Review books going back a decade at least, if not 15 years, which is to say, George W. Bush's second inaugural, the ending of freedom at home depends on the ending of tyranny abroad. And really, we can basically vanquish tyranny completely across the world. Now that statement itself had freighted in with it a certain view of history, even a historicist view of history, if we want to get fancy, where times were on the march and eventually we would have liberal democracy across the globe. But if that's the way you look at history and progress, then it's perfectly consonant in a way, not perfectly, but plenty consonant in a way that the people that come after you in control of the levers of political power and sort of adopting your general view of the progress of history, but maybe for different reasons, then say, yes, you're quite right. And tyranny abroad includes, this whole suite of rights that we now define in a changing way to keep up with the times. So vanquishing tyranny abroad, to pick up on Seth's point, includes, we will not be safe here at home because our freedom here at home means transgender rights and the latest evolution of women's rights, increasingly untethered from older understandings of natural law or natural rights. We have to push that abroad until we bring that to all the benighted lands across the world. We can't have perpetual peace and we can't have justice across the land. And it's our solemn moral duty to try to help affect this across the world. people wonder why we have forever wars, and it seems to be a bipartisan commitment at the principled level, however much they may differ from administration to administration in their particular rhetoric and their particular hotspots to address. But this is the driving force of modern American foreign policy, and we wonder why we spend trillions and trillions of dollars and don't seem to make much progress by the older measures of prudent statecraft.
I mean, in a sense, part of the problem is that the United States of America is not defined by, like, geographically. I mean, for a while, I think only the United States and the Soviet Union were set up such that, like, any place could become part of it. I mean, France has outlying parts of itself that are still considered France, but we know what France is. But I think what I'm getting at is the idea that since the United States can incorporate new states all over the world, we sort of have this vision of America, of the USA, as including anywhere. Every place is a potential American state, or, could be influenced by it. And, everyone in the world is a potential American, as we see with our current immigration policies. So there is a strange perversity or it's a problem in a sense that our expansionist origins lead to this outlook, maybe. I mean, I may be getting a little carried away here, but I think you see my point.
Yeah, a little bit. But I think you're right, Seth, in the sense that especially after, I don't want to lay everything on the progressive era or anything else. A lot has changed since the early years of the 20th century. But I think you're right. And it especially becomes true when we sever the link between natural rights and government by consent and American principles as they might be laid out in the Declaration of Independence. So you then have this free-floating notion of Americanism being the latest evolution of the equality principle as laid out by just to take one example, the leading edge of the left, or the intellectually lazy leading edge of sort of the establishment right, which is to say, free-floating rights and any notion of government by consent and the particularity of a certain political community and its consensual exercise over who can be new members is all painted as racist. I mean, then, the world's your oyster, with the result being deployments everywhere, the sort of police actions all the time, and furtherance of rights as their justification or social justice justification, and really no limiting principle.
I mean, Hawaii is really not in America.
Yeah, it's in the middle of the ocean.
Geographically.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah. Much easier case can be made for Puerto Rico, a longtime protectorate, and sort of, incorporated colony, as it were. But yeah, Hawaii, I mean, it's, what is it? It's a 5-hour plane ride to get there, right? It's literally in the middle of the ocean. I love Hawaii. It's a tiny place. It's beautiful. But no, it actually, it illustrates your point in a way that, and it's a state, right? It's not an imperial holding. So in a way that Algeria for France could never really be France, given French history and its French nationalism, even the most benign form. Yeah, you're right about that. It's just a different way of doing government from first principles. But we long argue at Claremont that first principles properly understood would, I think, militate against any sort of permanently expanding state-by-state American regime across the globe. And I know that's not your argument, but it's hard for people to keep straight, as my point being, especially as we sort of distance ourselves from the old tradition of natural rights and consent. It becomes very, very difficult to argue for any limiting principle.
Yeah, like the natural names for all of these places are like all forbidden to us, like the colonies, right? Like, I mean, the analogs for this in the ancient world, at least, are like, parts of Italy that surrounded Rome, which eventually demanded the franchise, and people kind of like handed out various like markers of citizenship to them as a way of gaining favor, either with them, right, like getting their vote, or with the people at home who for whatever reason wanted like the social war to end and all this stuff, like, or just like sending out little like strategic bases across the world where you feel like you can be protected against your enemies abroad, the Seleucid Empire or the Chinese Communist Party or like Japan or whatever. Like Helen Andrews, I think in her book Boomers, points out at some point that like with the collapse of the British Empire and this sort of rise in like anti-colonialism, the main like source of prior wisdom for how to deal with these sorts of international commitments was cut off because we simply couldn't admit the resemblance. Like it's no longer morally acceptable for us or anybody to think of themselves as an empire or as having sort of like imperial commitments, imperial territories. But that just, all that means is that we just lie. We just like, talk around things and invent euphemisms and stumble over problems that have been part of being a superpower since there have been superpowers.
Yeah, and isn't that the same? I mean, it's the same dynamic we see all over, where you have an elite class that can't admit they're elite, they can't admit that they're in power, and really, what's going on is it's a complete empire. It's a global empire. That's what they want. That's what the Uniparty wants, and all the permutations of that, they're all relevant, right? So you're right. All the lessons of the British Empire are completely correct. The Roman Empire, any empire, that's exactly what they actually want. And they pretend like you can just do this without, all the nasty stuff and crucifying all the slaves and having a caste system. It's totally possible. It's all good. But when you look at what they're doing with their insatiable thirst for impoverished labor, these people talk about, colored bodies, right? They seem to be obsessed with that in grad school. But this is really what the white liberal class wants, right? The wealthy class. They want as many impoverished people as possible, apparently. And what that's going to create, what open borders would create, the phrase that Hillary Clinton actually uses in South America while giving a speech for Goldman Sachs. I mean, what they really want, if you have open borders, you're going to get a caste system. That's the only way to make that work. So if you devalue the notion of citizenship such that it really means benefits, right? And you create completely open borders, then what you're going to do is create a hierarchical caste system where people on the top are really running things. And this has happened over and over again. And that's exactly what they actually want to create and are creating as we speak. And it's disgusting and it's hilarious because of the denial in a way, if you step back. But that's really what they want. I mean, they want a situation in which you have the certain passport, you're a member of the global elite, you can go wherever you want, and then all the labor beneath you is all mixed up and basically all indentured servitude. And that's just one aspect of empire. The other aspect of empire that we should talk about is the only way to, in human history, at least so far, that you can see, to really take a lot of people who are very different and very different cultures and mix them all up and still keep the peace, is by ruthless centralized power and making sure everyone bows to the central authority without exception. That's how the Romans did it. I mean, you could do whatever you wanted in your country, but if you crossed Rome, you were going to pay the price. And that's really what they're setting up now. It's the same thing. If you cross the centralized power, you will be deplatformed, you will be destroyed, you will be crushed. And that's exactly the way to control lots of disparate people. It's what's required. It's just like a law of nature almost. That's what's needed. Those two aspects are just two of it. I mean, it just boggles the mind, right? I mean, we're living in a fantasy world in which we have to speak out of two sides of our mouths about these things. And I don't know, I don't know how long it lasts, but how can the right needs to stop pretending that these people don't want a kind of empire? And some of the left has been right about that for a long time.
Yeah. And we have to wrap up, but you see it. One nice example is the sort of establishment Washington treatment of, and at various points Poland and Hungary these days, which is to say, yeah, I mean, you know, representative government, even in these places where we should not, we should not exercise any real governmental control. Yeah, democracy's okay, but only if you vote for the things that we think you ought to vote for. So that playbook is evolving at home and getting more toothsome from the left. We've argued on this podcast, I've certainly said it, that in various ways and fits and starts, and it's not a clean line and everything. But I mean, especially the progressive left has considered the Republican Party in America illegitimate since Nixon's landslide reelection. And that is also playing out abroad, which is to say, government by consent of the people is fine as long as you agree with precept X, Y, and Z that we offer as the latest evolution of rights and justice. That is a recipe, Matt, you're quite right, for imperialism and for despotism, and that's where we're trending. So we wanted to talk a bit about, but we don't have time. Everyone go look. We'll talk about it next week, and I think there'll be some coverage growing out of it, which we'll also cover. But Jim Banks, the chairman of the Republican Study Committee, congressman from Indiana, and I should say sometimes author at The American Mind, has issued this bracing, intelligent, and politically realistic memo to Kevin McCarthy called, the subject line is, it was an email, but you can go find it. Just go Google Jim Banks, RSC, memo, McCarthy, working class party. But the subject line is urgent, cementing GOP as the working class party. We'll take that up next week. It's a very nice analysis of the current coalition and how it's changed in the last 10 years on the right and what we ought to do about it. I think regular listeners will not be surprised at Jim Banks's conclusions and our agreement with it in various ways. But we will have to leave that for next week so we don't waste more of your time or belabor the point. Thank you for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writing, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and our new Washington Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. While I'm plugging stuff, I should mention that Jim Banks memo I mentioned to Kevin McCarthy about the future of the working class GOP, we've taken up on our Substack, which for now is free for all, but we will soon put behind a paywall. I know we threaten this weekly and you're all getting tired of it, but it will happen. We've built a large audience and it'll be fun. But anyway, go check that out at americanmind.substack.com. Please rate, share, and subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee. Despite Jake's habit of flashing time at me right in the middle of interesting discussions that happen to run over an hour, I'll forgive you for now, Jake. And thank you all for listening. Talk to you next week.